My name is Sarah Martinez, and I'm 31 years old. 6 months after my wedding, my mother-in-law stood in front of our entire extended family during Thanksgiving dinner and declared that I was nothing but a gold digger who trapped her precious son for his trust fund. What Linda Hartwell didn't know was that I had secretly paid for our entire $40,000 wedding, including her designer dress, and I had the bank statements to prove it. The morning routine at Hartwell Associates Financial Planning had become as predictable as clockwork. I arrived at 7:30 sharp, always the first one in the office, my coffee still steaming as I unlocked the frosted glass doors that bore my boss's name in elegant gold lettering. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The irony wasn't lost on me that I worked for a financial planning firm while secretly managing my own substantial portfolio that nobody, not even my husband, knew existed. I had been Michael Hartwell's executive assistant for 3 years, and in that time, I had transformed from a recent MBA graduate drowning in student debt to a woman who had quietly built a 6-figure savings account through careful investments and side consulting work. The consulting happened after hours, on weekends, through encrypted communications with clients who paid premium rates for financial analysis they couldn't get anywhere else. I specialized in helping tech startups navigate their Series A funding, and my success rate was becoming legendary in certain Silicon Valley circles. Michael walked in at 8:15, just as he always did, his dark hair slightly tousled from his morning run. He was handsome in that effortless way that came from good genetics and better grooming, but what had drawn me to him wasn't his looks or his family's money. It was the way he treated everyone with genuine respect, from the janitor to the most important clients. In a world where I'd grown up watching my mother clean houses for wealthy families who barely acknowledged her existence, Michael's basic human decency had felt revolutionary. "Good morning, beautiful," he said, stopping by my desk with that smile that still made my heart skip. He leaned down to kiss my forehead, a gesture so natural it felt like breathing. "How's the Henderson portfolio looking?" "Up 12% this quarter," I replied, pulling up the spreadsheet I'd been perfecting since 6 in the morning. "I've restructured their asset allocation to take advantage of the emerging markets trend we discussed." "The numbers don't lie, Michael. Your instincts were right." What Michael didn't know was that I had been the one to initially identify the emerging markets opportunity. I'd spent weeks analyzing global economic patterns, cross-referencing political stability indices with market volatility reports, and creating predictive models that would have impressed the analysts at Goldman Sachs. Then I'd carefully planted seeds of suggestion during our strategy meetings, making him think the insights were his own discoveries. It wasn't manipulation, it was survival. In the financial world, brilliant ideas from executive assistants were often dismissed or stolen. Brilliant ideas from the boss's son were implemented and celebrated. The phone rang, and I answered with my professional voice. "Hartwell and Associates, this is Sarah speaking. How may I help you today?" The caller was Mrs. Pemberton, one of our most demanding clients, requesting changes to her retirement portfolio that would have been financial suicide. I spent 20 minutes diplomatically redirecting her towards sounder investments while making her feel like every decision was entirely her own idea. "You're incredible with her," Michael said after I hung up. "She actually likes you, which is more than I can say for anyone else who's tried to work with her account. She just wants to feel heard," I said simply. "Everyone does." Michael's father, Richard Hartwell, chose that moment to sweep into the office like a corporate hurricane. Richard was 62, silver-haired, and carried himself with the kind of confidence that came from never having been told no by anyone who mattered. He had built Hartwell and Associates from a small accounting firm into one of Chicago's most prestigious financial planning companies, and he never let anyone forget it. "Sarah, coffee," he said, without looking at me, his attention already focused on something on his phone. The usual. "Good morning, Mr. Hartwell," I replied evenly, already rising to prepare his complicated order. "Double shot espresso, 1 pump vanilla, steamed oat milk, exactly 160 degrees. I had learned early in my employment that Richard's coffee order was a test of attention to detail that extended far beyond beverage preparation. As I worked the expensive espresso machine that Richard had installed in the office kitchen, I could hear him talking to Michael about the quarterly reports. Richard's voice carried easily through the open office space, and I caught fragments of conversation about profit margins, client retention, and expansion plans. What struck me, as it always did, was how Michael's voice changed when his father was around. The easy confidence became more measured, more careful, as if he were still seeking approval from a man who rarely gave it freely. I returned with Richard's coffee, setting it down on his desk with a small spoon and one packet of raw sugar, exactly as he preferred. He barely acknowledged my presence, which was typical. In the 3 years I had worked there, Richard Hartwell had never once asked me about my background, my education, or my career goals. To him I was simply a function, a well-dressed, well-trained extension of the office equipment. What Richard didn't know was that I had been quietly observing his business practices, learning from his successes, and noting his blind spots. I had identified at least 6 areas where the firm could improve its client services and increase profitability, but I kept those observations to myself. The last assistant who had offered unsolicited business advice had been politely but firmly reminded of her place. I was smarter than that. Michael and I had been dating for 8 months when he first brought me to his family's home for Sunday dinner. The Hartwell estate in Lake Forest was exactly what I had expected, a sprawling Georgian colonial with manicured gardens, a circular driveway, and the kind of understated luxury that whispered rather than shouted its expense. I had chosen my outfit carefully, a navy blue dress that was elegant but not too fashionable, expensive but not obviously so. I had learned to navigate these waters by watching and listening, by understanding that the wrong accessory or the right story could shift perceptions in ways that mattered. Linda Hartwell answered the door herself, though I suspected they had staff who usually handled such tasks. She was impeccably dressed in cream-colored slacks and a cashmere sweater that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. Her smile was warm but appraising, and I felt the weight of evaluation in her gaze as she looked me up and down. "You must be Sarah," she said, extending a perfectly manicured hand. "Michael's told us so much about you. Please come in." The interior of the house was a study in tasteful wealth. Original artwork hung on walls painted in sophisticated neutral tones, and every piece of furniture looked like it had been selected by a professional decorator. Fresh flowers filled crystal vases on polished surfaces, and everything was clean in that way that required significant staff to maintain. I had grown up in a house where my mother worked 2 jobs to keep the lights on, and the contrast was not lost on me. Dinner was served in a dining room that could have accommodated 20 people comfortably, though only 5 of us were present. Michael's older sister, Catherine, had joined us with her husband, a pediatric surgeon named David, who seemed genuinely pleasant. Catherine worked in marketing for a non-profit organization, and I could tell she was making an effort to include me in the conversation without being condescending. "So Sarah," Linda said as we began the soup course, "tell us about your family. What do your parents do?" I had prepared for this question, knowing it would come eventually. My father manages warehouse operations for a logistics company, and my mother works in hospitality management. It was technically true, though it didn't capture the full reality of my father's 60-hour weeks loading trucks, or my mother's job cleaning hotel rooms at the Marriott downtown. "How interesting," Linda replied, though her tone suggested it was anything but. "And where did you go to school?" "Northwestern," I said simply. "MBA in finance, graduated summa cum laude." What I didn't mention was the scholarship that had made it possible, or the 3 part-time jobs I had worked to cover living expenses, or the fact that I had finished in the top 5% of my class, while most of my classmates were focused on networking at exclusive social events I couldn't afford to attend. Richard leaned forward slightly. "Northwestern has an excellent business program. What's your career trajectory? Are you planning to move into financial planning, or is the assistant position a temporary stepping stone?" The question was loaded with assumptions, and I could feel Michael tense beside me. "I'm learning a great deal about client relationship management and business operations," I said diplomatically. "The experience has been invaluable for understanding how successful firms operate from the ground up." What I didn't say was that I already knew more about portfolio management than half the junior advisors at Hartwell Associates, or that my side consulting business was generating more revenue than some of the firm's smaller accounts. I didn't mention that I had been headhunted by 2 competing firms in the past 6 months, or that I had turned down both offers because I was building something bigger than a traditional career path. The conversation moved to safer topics, and I navigated the evening with careful attention to social cues and family dynamics. I noticed how Linda's eyes lingered on my jewelry, assessing the quality and likely cost. I had worn pieces from my grandmother's collection, genuine but not ostentatious, chosen specifically to avoid appearing either cheap or inappropriately expensive. After dinner, Michael walked me to my car, his hand warm on the small of my back. "You were perfect tonight," he said softly. "I know my family can be a little overwhelming at first." "They're lovely," I replied, which was mostly true. "Your mother is very gracious, and your sister is delightful." I didn't mention that I had caught Linda whispering something to Catherine in the kitchen that had made them both glance in my direction, with expressions I couldn't quite read. The drive home to my apartment in Lincoln Park took 40 minutes, giving me plenty of time to process the evening. I had passed the first test, but I was under no illusions about the challenges ahead. The Hartwell family lived in a world where everyone had a place, and they would need time to figure out where exactly I fit into their carefully ordered universe. My apartment was a 1-bedroom unit in a renovated brownstone, nothing fancy but clean and comfortable. I had furnished it carefully with pieces from estate sales and consignment shops, creating a space that felt sophisticated without requiring a trust fund. The walls were painted in warm neutral tones, and I had invested in good lighting that made even my second-hand furniture look elegant. I kicked off my heels and poured myself a glass of wine, settling onto my couch with my laptop.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
This was my favorite time of day, when I could drop the professional facade and focus on the work that truly energized me. I opened my encrypted communication platform and found 3 new inquiries from potential consulting clients. One was a renewable energy startup looking for help with their pre-IPO financial structuring. Another was a software company needing guidance on international expansion funding, and the third was a biotech firm seeking advice on venture capital negotiations. I spent the next 2 hours crafting detailed responses, drawing on market research I had conducted during my lunch breaks and economic analyses I had prepared during quiet moments at the office. This work required a different kind of intelligence than what I displayed at Hartwell Associates. Here I could be direct, innovative, and unafraid to challenge conventional wisdom. My clients paid premium rates because I delivered results that traditional consulting firms couldn't match. By the time I closed my laptop, it was past midnight, and I had secured 2 new contracts that would add another $15,000 to my growing savings account. I had been building this nest egg for 3 years, living far below my means and investing every extra dollar with the same careful analysis I applied to client portfolios. The money represented something more than financial security. It represented choices, independence, and the kind of freedom that my mother had never been able to imagine. The next morning, Michael was waiting by my desk with coffee and a smile that made my heart flutter. "Thank you for last night," he said quietly. "I know family dinners can be intimidating, but you handled everything perfectly." "My parents were impressed. I'm glad they liked me," I replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. "Your family is important to you, so they're important to me." What I didn't say was that I had already begun preparing for the next phase of evaluation. I had researched Linda's favorite charities, Catherine's nonprofit work, and Richard's business philosophy. I understood that acceptance into the Hartwell family would require more than one successful dinner party. It would require a sustained campaign of proving my worthiness according to their standards, even as I continued building my own independent success. The weeks that followed established a pattern. Michael and I fell into a comfortable rhythm of dates that gradually became more serious and more public. We attended charity events where I met his extended social circle, went to business dinners, where I charmed his colleagues, and spent weekends at his apartment in the Gold Coast, a space that reflected his family's wealth in its casual elegance. I was careful not to move too quickly, not to appear too eager or too calculating. When Michael suggested I meet his college friends, I expressed genuine interest. When he invited me to join his family's annual ski trip to Aspen, I graciously accepted while privately calculating how much the appropriate wardrobe would cost. I understood that every social interaction was both genuine relationship building and strategic positioning. My consulting business continued to grow, and I found myself working with increasingly high-profile clients. A tech executive I had helped secure Series B funding recommended me to another startup founder, who recommended me to a venture capital firm looking for freelance analysts. My reputation was spreading through networks I couldn't access through traditional channels, and my income was approaching levels that would have seemed impossible just 2 years earlier. The irony of the situation was not lost on me. While the Hartwell family was evaluating my suitability as Michael's partner, I was building wealth that exceeded what some of their friends and colleagues had inherited. While they wondered about my family's social standing, I was developing expertise that commanded respect in circles where results mattered more than pedigree. Michael and I had been dating for 14 months when he started mentioning marriage in casual conversation. Nothing direct, nothing that felt like pressure, just gentle references to our future together that suggested he was thinking long-term. I found myself both excited and terrified by the prospect. I loved Michael genuinely, but I also understood that marrying into the Hartwell family would require careful navigation of expectations and assumptions that had nothing to do with love. The proposal came on a Saturday evening in February, during what I thought was a casual dinner at his apartment. Michael had prepared my favorite meal, opened a bottle of wine that was probably worth more than my monthly rent, and created an atmosphere of intimate romance that felt both natural and slightly too perfect. When he got down on one knee and pulled out a ring box from Tiffany, I realized that every detail had been carefully planned. "Sarah Martinez," he said, his voice slightly shaky with nerves, "you have made me happier than I ever thought possible. You challenge me, you support me, and you make me want to be a better man every single day. Will you marry me?" The ring was beautiful, a classic solitaire setting, with a diamond that caught the candlelight and threw rainbows across the white tablecloth. It was exactly the kind of ring I would have chosen if I had been thinking about engagement rings, which I hadn't been, at least not seriously. The proposal was romantic and heartfelt, and Michael's nervousness was endearing in its authenticity. "Yes," I said, because I meant it, because I loved him, and because the alternative was too complicated to contemplate in that moment. Yes, of course, yes, the ring fit perfectly, which meant Michael had somehow determined my size without me noticing. As he slipped it onto my finger and kissed me with relief and joy, I found myself thinking about the practical implications of what had just happened. Marriage to Michael would mean joining the Hartwell family officially, with all the expectations and assumptions that entailed. It would mean navigating Linda's opinions about appropriate behavior for a daughter-in-law, Richard's evaluation of my contribution to the family's social standing, and the ongoing challenge of maintaining my independent identity while fulfilling traditional roles. We called his parents immediately, and Linda's squeal of delight was audible even through the phone. She insisted we come over right away so she could see the ring and begin discussing wedding plans. Richard's congratulations were warm but brief, and I could hear the underlying assumption that this development would be positive for everyone involved. The drive to Lake Forest felt different this time, charged with new meaning and new pressures. Michael held my hand as he drove, periodically glancing at the ring and smiling with satisfaction. I found myself wondering whether he had discussed the proposal with his parents beforehand, whether the timing had been influenced by family conversations I wasn't privy to, whether this next chapter of my life would require even more careful performance than what had come before. Linda met us at the door with champagne already chilled and tears of joy streaming down her perfectly made-up face. She embraced me with genuine warmth, examining the ring and pronouncing it absolutely perfect. Richard's congratulations were more measured, but seemed sincere, and Catherine called within minutes of our arrival, to express her excitement and offer her services as maid of honor. As we sat in the Hartwell family room, discussing potential wedding dates and venues, I realized that my careful financial planning was about to become more important than ever. Weddings in the Hartwell social circle were not simple celebrations. They were productions that required significant financial investment, complex social coordination, and months of detailed planning. The expectation, never explicitly stated but clearly understood, was that the groom's family would handle the major expenses, while the bride's family contributed what they could. The problem was that my parents could contribute almost nothing to a wedding that would meet Hartwell family expectations. My father's warehouse salary and my mother's hotel wages had improved slightly over the years, but they were still living paycheck to paycheck with little room for luxury expenses. They had been proud when I graduated from Northwestern, proud when I found a good job, and proud when I started dating someone who treated me well, but they had no experience with the kind of social and financial expectations that came with marrying into established wealth. I excused myself to use the bathroom and took a moment to look at myself in the Hartwell's guest powder room mirror. The woman looking back at me wore a diamond engagement ring worth more than my parents' annual income and was discussing wedding plans that would cost more than most people's cars. She looked confident, happy, and appropriately grateful for her good fortune. What the mirror couldn't show was the complex calculation happening behind her smile, the growing realization that the next few months would require financial and emotional resources that nobody else in the room could imagine. When I returned to the family room, Linda was showing Michael photos from Catherine's wedding on her phone, discussing flowers and venues and photographers, with the kind of detailed enthusiasm that suggested this process would involve significant input from the groom's mother. I sat down next to Michael and smiled at the appropriate moments, asking thoughtful questions and expressing excitement about possibilities that I was already mentally calculating in terms of cost and complexity. The evening continued with champagne, congratulations, and increasingly detailed discussions about wedding logistics. Catherine offered to help with vendor selection, Linda suggested several appropriate venues, and Richard made casual mention of the family's preferred caterer and florist. Every suggestion was offered with love and enthusiasm, and every suggestion represented financial obligations that would stretch traditional wedding budgets beyond recognition. As we finally said our goodbyes and drove back to the city, Michael reached over to squeeze my hand. "That went perfectly," he said with satisfaction. "Mom is so excited she's probably already started making lists. I think she's been planning my wedding since I was born. She certainly has strong opinions about what makes a good celebration," I replied diplomatically. "I can tell this is going to be important to her." What I didn't say was that I had already begun calculating the costs of the kind of wedding Linda Hartwell had in mind. The venues she had mentioned started at $20,000 just for the space rental. The photographers she recommended charged $8,000 for wedding packages. The florist she preferred required minimum orders that exceeded what most people spent on their entire celebrations. The catering, the music, the transportation, the accommodations for out-of-town guests, every element would be multiplied by the standards expected in the Hartwell social circle. That night, alone in my apartment with my laptop open to my private financial spreadsheets, I faced a decision that would define the next chapter of my life. I could have an honest conversation with Michael about my family's financial limitations, and hope that love would bridge the gap between expectation and reality. I could suggest a smaller, simpler celebration that would be more appropriate for our combined actual resources. I could ask Michael's family to cover expenses beyond what my parents could reasonably afford, and accept the debt of gratitude that would create. Or I could pay for the wedding myself. The consulting business I had built over 3 years had generated more than enough savings to cover a $40,000 wedding. My investment portfolio, carefully managed and steadily growing, could absorb the expense without significantly impacting my long-term financial security. I had the resources to give Michael the kind of celebration his family expected, while protecting my parents from financial embarrassment and avoiding the complicated dynamics of accepting charity from my future in-laws. The decision, when I finally made it, felt both empowering and terrifying. I would plan and pay for a wedding that would meet every expectation, exceed every standard, and establish my place in the Hartwell family on my own terms. Nobody would need to know where the money came from. Michael would assume his parents had handled the major expenses, his parents would assume I had family resources they hadn't been told about, and my parents would be quietly relieved that their daughter's wedding wouldn't require sacrifices they couldn't afford. I spent the rest of the night researching vendors, comparing prices, and creating a comprehensive budget that would deliver the kind of celebration Linda Hartwell was already envisioning. By dawn, I had a plan that would cost exactly $42,000, including a $1,500 designer dress for Linda and accommodations for Michael's extended family. The money would come from my consulting income and investment returns, transferred through carefully structured payments that would leave no obvious paper trail, connecting the expenses to my personal accounts. The next 6 months would be the most complex financial and social performance of my life. I would plan a wedding that would establish my place in Chicago society, while concealing the fact that I had paid for every detail. I would smile graciously at comments about my family's generosity, while knowing that every dollar had come from work I had done in secret during evenings and weekends. I would accept compliments about the celebration, while understanding that I had created an illusion so complete that even I sometimes forgot where the money had really come from. But that morning, sitting in my apartment with the engagement ring catching the early sunlight, I felt something I had never experienced before. For the first time in my adult life, I had both love and financial independence. I had found a partner who valued me for who I was, and I had built resources that would allow me to protect that relationship on my own terms. The wedding would be beautiful, the marriage would be genuine, and nobody would ever know that Sarah Martinez had bought her own fairy tale with money she had earned through brilliance they had never bothered to recognize. The next morning brought the first real test of my plan. Linda called at 8:30, her voice bubbling with excitement about wedding venues. She had already scheduled appointments at 3 locations for that afternoon, and she wanted me to join her for what she called the fun part of wedding planning. I met her at the first venue, a historic mansion in Winnetka that had been converted into an event space. The coordinator, a polished woman in her 50s named Margaret, greeted us with the kind of professional enthusiasm reserved for clients who clearly had substantial budgets. The tour began in the main ballroom, a stunning space with crystal chandeliers, marble floors, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking manicured gardens. "This is absolutely perfect," Linda breathed, running her hand along the mahogany wainscoting. "Sarah, can't you just picture it? The ceremony could be in the garden, cocktails on the terrace, and dinner in here. It's exactly what Michael deserves." "It's beautiful," I agreed, mentally calculating the rental cost. Margaret had quoted $18,000 for a Saturday evening in June, plus service charges, gratuity, and vendor fees that would bring the total closer to $25,000. The price included tables, chairs, and linens, but everything else would be additional. Linda was already envisioning the details, discussing flower arrangements and lighting options with Margaret as if the decision had already been made. I found myself nodding along while privately reviewing the backup venues I had researched, none of which would meet the standards Linda clearly expected. The second venue was even more expensive, a lakefront estate that charged $30,000 just for the space rental. Linda loved the water views and the romantic ambiance, but I could see that even she was slightly taken aback by the cost. The third option was more reasonable at $15,000, but Linda dismissed it as too small and too modern for what she called a proper celebration. We ended the day at a coffee shop near the lake, Linda's enthusiasm undimmed despite the shocking price quotes. She pulled out a leather-bound notebook and began writing lists with the kind of methodical organization that suggested years of experience planning similar events. "Now about your dress," she said without looking up from her notes. "Catherine used Madame Boudoir for her wedding, and the results were absolutely stunning. I've already called to schedule your appointment for next week." I had heard of Madame Boudoir, a French designer who specialized in custom wedding gowns for Chicago's most elite brides. Her dresses started at $8,000 and could easily reach $20,000 for the kind of elaborate creation Linda probably had in mind. I smiled and expressed appropriate gratitude while calculating how this expense would fit into my carefully planned budget. The next few days brought a constant stream of wedding-related communications. Linda forwarded emails from florists, photographers, and caterers, each one representing another significant expense that nobody had explicitly discussed paying for. Catherine called to discuss bridesmaid dresses and bachelorette party plans. Michael's Aunt Margaret sent a list of family friends who would need invitations, expanding the guest count beyond what I had originally anticipated. I found myself living a double life that was even more complex than before. During the day, I maintained my role as Michael's assistant, professionally managing his schedule and client communications while secretly handling wedding vendor negotiations during my lunch breaks. In the evenings, I worked on consulting projects that would fund the celebration everyone assumed someone else was financing. My parents, meanwhile, had their own concerns about the wedding plans. I visited them on a Sunday afternoon, finding my mother in her small kitchen preparing dinner with the same careful attention she had always given to making modest ingredients stretch into satisfying meals. My father was watching baseball in the living room, still wearing the uniform shirt from his weekend shift at the warehouse. "Misha," my mother said, embracing me with hands that still smelled faintly of the industrial cleaning products she used at work. "Tell us about the wedding plans." "Mrs. Linda," she calls me every few days with updates. I sat at the kitchen table where I had done homework throughout high school, watching my mother move around the familiar space with practiced efficiency. She had been excited about Linda's phone calls at first, flattered by the attention and inclusion, but I could see worry creeping into her expressions as the conversations revealed the scale of celebration being planned. "The venue is beautiful," I said carefully. "Very elegant, very appropriate for Michael's family's social circle." I didn't mention the cost, knowing it would keep my parents awake at night with anxiety about their financial contribution. "Your father and we want to help," my mother said quietly. "We don't have much, but this is our only daughter's wedding. We've been saving, but Mrs. Linda, she talks about flowers that cost more than your father makes in a week." "Mom," I said firmly, taking her hands in mine. "You and Dad have given me everything that matters. Your love, your values, your example of working hard for your family. That's worth more than any amount of money. But the photographer she wants, the one who took pictures at Catherine's wedding, he costs more than we make in 2 months. Your father, he's talking about taking extra shifts, maybe borrowing against his retirement, but Sarah, we can't keep up with these expenses." The pain in my mother's voice was exactly what I had hoped to avoid. She had spent her entire adult life watching wealthy families from a distance, cleaning their homes and serving at their events, never imagining her daughter would marry into that world. Now she was faced with expectations that threatened to bankrupt the modest life she and my father had built through decades of careful budgeting and sacrifice. "Listen to me," I said gently. "Michael's family has resources, and they understand that different families contribute in different ways. Nobody expects you and Dad to match their spending. Your presence, your joy, your blessing on my marriage, that's what matters most." It was partially true and completely inadequate. Linda had made several references to traditional wedding expenses that the bride's family typically covered, suggestions offered with the kind of casual assumption that revealed her complete lack of understanding about my parents' financial reality. She meant well, but her good intentions were creating stress that my family didn't deserve. That night, I sat in my childhood bedroom, now converted into my mother's sewing room, surrounded by evidence of her creative resourcefulness. She had always made something beautiful from whatever materials she could afford, whether it was Halloween costumes crafted from fabric remnants or birthday decorations created from construction paper and imagination. Looking around the room, I realized that paying for the wedding wasn't just about meeting social expectations or protecting my pride. It was about protecting my parents from a situation that would force them to choose between financial security and their daughter's happiness. The dress appointment at Madame Dubois proved to be as expensive as I had feared. The boutique occupied an entire floor of a Michigan Avenue high-rise, its minimalist decor and hushed atmosphere designed to convey exclusivity and sophistication. Linda arrived early, already deep in conversation with Madame Dubois herself about silhouettes and fabrics that would be appropriate for a June garden ceremony. Madame Dubois was exactly what I had expected, a tiny French woman in her 60s who possessed an intimidating combination of artistic vision and business acumen. She examined me with the critical eye of someone accustomed to dressing Chicago's most prominent brides, asking questions about my preferences while clearly forming her own opinions about what would work best. "For you," she announced after several minutes of evaluation, "something classic but not traditional. You have an elegant figure, but you are not a little girl playing dress-up. You need sophistication, romance, but with strength. Something that shows you belong with this family, but that you are not trying to disappear into their expectations." Her assessment was uncomfortably accurate, and I found myself nodding as she described dresses that would cost between $12,000 and $15,000. Linda was clearly delighted by the designer's attention and suggestions, adding her own requests for details that would complement the venue and season. The fitting process took 3 hours and resulted in a design that was undeniably perfect. Madame Dubois had created something that would photograph beautifully, satisfy Linda's vision of appropriate elegance, and make me feel confident rather than costumed. The dress would require 4 additional fittings over the next 3 months, each one an opportunity to adjust not just the gown but my growing comfort with the role I was preparing to play. The vendor selection process continued with similar attention to detail and expense. The photographer Linda recommended charged $12,000 for wedding day coverage, plus engagement photos, and a bound album that would document every moment of the celebration. The florist required a minimum order of $8,000 for the kind of elaborate arrangements Linda envisioned throughout the venue. The string quartet that had played at Catherine's wedding cost $4,000 for the ceremony and cocktail hour, with an additional fee for special song requests. Each meeting, each consultation, each decision added layers to the financial commitment I had made to myself. I found myself becoming expert at appearing grateful and excited while mentally adjusting budget categories and consulting income projections. The wedding was becoming not just a celebration but a complex financial undertaking that required the same analytical skills I used for client portfolios. My consulting business continued to grow, partly because I was now working with desperate intensity to fund the wedding. I took on additional projects, accepted shorter deadlines, and raised my rates to reflect the premium value of my analysis. My clients in the tech sector were increasingly willing to pay top dollar for insights that could make the difference between successful funding rounds and failed ventures. One particularly lucrative project involved helping a startup navigate their Series A funding process. The company had developed revolutionary solar panel technology, but their financial projections were conservative to the point of being counterproductive. I spent 2 weeks remodeling their market analysis, identifying revenue opportunities their internal team had missed, and crafting investment materials that demonstrated the true scale of their potential profitability. The result was a funding round that exceeded their targets by 40%, and my fee for the project was enough to cover the wedding photographer, florist, and music combined. The startup founder, a brilliant engineer named David Chen, sent me a bonus payment with a note expressing gratitude for work that had transformed his company's trajectory. He also referred me to 3 other startups that needed similar guidance, expanding my client base just when I needed the additional income most. Michael noticed my increased energy and focus, but attributed it to wedding excitement rather than financial necessity. "You're absolutely glowing," he said one evening as we reviewed invitation designs Linda had selected. "I think planning this wedding is bringing out a side of you I've never seen before." I smiled and agreed, letting him believe that my enthusiasm stemmed from anticipating our future rather than funding our present. The truth was that managing the wedding budget while growing my consulting business was providing a kind of professional satisfaction I had never experienced. Every successful client project felt like a victory not just for my career, but for my ability to create the life I wanted on my own terms. The invitation process revealed another layer of complexity I hadn't anticipated. Linda had selected a stationer, whose work was legendary among Chicago's social elite, a woman who created custom invitations that were works of art requiring 6 weeks of production time. The invitations themselves cost $3 each, but with calligraphy, response cards and mailing, the total came to nearly $2,000 for the guest list that had grown to include every member of Michael's extended family and social circle.
Linda presented the invitation proofs with the kind of pride reserved for truly significant achievements. "Look at this paper quality," she said, running her fingers over the thick cardstock, "and the calligraphy is absolutely perfect. This is exactly the kind of impression we want to make." The invitations were beautiful, there was no denying that. They conveyed elegance, sophistication, and the kind of attention to detail that suggested the celebration itself would be equally impressive. They also represented more money than my parents spent on groceries in 6 months, a fact that Linda would never have considered because it was completely outside her frame of reference. I approved the design and authorized the printing, adding another line item to my private wedding budget while expressing appropriate appreciation for Linda's selection. The invitations would be mailed in 4 weeks, officially announcing to Chicago society that Sarah Martinez was marrying into the Hartwell family with all the pomp and circumstance such an occasion demanded. Catherine's enthusiasm for her role as maid of honor brought its own set of expenses. She had selected bridesmaid dresses from a boutique in New York, requiring all the attendants to travel for fittings or pay additional fees for remote alterations. The dresses themselves cost $800 each, plus accessories and shoes that Catherine had carefully coordinated to create the perfect aesthetic for wedding photos. My college roommate Jessica called me after receiving her bridesmaid assignment with a mixture of excitement and concern. "Sarah, I'm so happy for you, but this dress costs more than my rent. Are you sure we need something this expensive? I can find something similar for half the price." I found myself in the uncomfortable position of maintaining the illusion that money was no object while understanding exactly how my friends felt about these expenses. I ended up quietly paying for Jessica's dress and those of my other 2 bridesmaids, presenting it as a gift from Michael's family, while using my consulting income to cover costs that were spiraling beyond anyone's original expectations. The bachelor and bachelorette parties presented another financial challenge. Catherine had planned a weekend in Napa Valley for the bridesmaids, complete with wine tastings, spa treatments, and accommodations at a resort that charged $600 per night. The total cost for each participant would exceed $2,000, an amount that was reasonable for Catherine and her social circle, but potentially devastating for friends who were still paying off student loans or saving for their own futures. I ended up covering most of the bachelorette party expenses as well, presenting it as enthusiasm for the celebration while privately calculating the impact on my carefully managed wedding budget. Michael's bachelor party, meanwhile, involved a long weekend in Las Vegas that his college friends had planned without any input from me, but with clear expectations about the kind of celebration appropriate for someone marrying into the Hartwell family. 3 months before the wedding, Linda organized what she called a family meeting to review final details and confirm arrangements. The meeting took place on a Sunday afternoon in the Hartwell's formal dining room, with notebooks and folders spread across the polished mahogany table like battle plans for a major campaign. Richard attended the meeting, his presence adding weight to discussions about logistics and timeline. Catherine brought her husband David, who had been designated as the family's point person for coordinating with vendors on the wedding day. Michael sat beside me, occasionally squeezing my hand when Linda's organizational intensity became overwhelming. Linda had prepared an agenda that covered everything from transportation arrangements for out-of-town guests to backup plans in case of rain during the garden ceremony. She had contacted hotels to reserve room blocks, coordinated with the venue about setup and breakdown schedules, and created detailed timelines for hair and makeup appointments that began at 6 in the morning. "Now about the final payments," Linda said, consulting her notes. "The venue requires full payment 2 weeks before the event, the caterer needs their balance 10 days prior, and the photographer wants payment on the wedding day. I assume your parents have coordinated with their vendors about timing." I had been dreading this moment, the point where financial arrangements would need to be explicitly discussed rather than politely assumed. The truth was that I had been making payments to vendors for months, using a complex system of cashier's checks and money transfers that obscured the source of the funds, while ensuring that every detail of the celebration was properly secured. "My parents and I have been working with all the vendors directly," I said carefully. "Everything is on schedule for payment according to their requirements. I think everyone will be very pleased with how smoothly everything comes together." It was technically accurate while being completely misleading, exactly the kind of diplomatic language I had learned to use when navigating complex family dynamics. Richard nodded approvingly, apparently satisfied that appropriate arrangements had been made. Linda made notes in her folder and moved on to discussing flower delivery schedules and music cues for the ceremony. Michael squeezed my hand under the table, his pride and gratitude evident in his smile. "I love how organized and capable you are," he whispered during a break in Linda's presentation. "This is going to be the most beautiful wedding Chicago has seen in years." His confidence in me was both touching and terrifying. He genuinely believed that everything was falling into place through some combination of family resources and natural good fortune, never questioning the mechanics of how a celebration this elaborate was actually being funded. His trust was complete, and his assumptions were reasonable, making my deception feel both necessary and increasingly uncomfortable. The final month before the wedding brought a crescendo of activity that required all my organizational skills and most of my remaining consulting income. Linda scheduled daily check-ins to review last-minute details, Catherine coordinated final dress fittings and beauty appointments, and my parents called repeatedly to express their excitement and anxiety about the approaching celebration. My mother had found a dress for the wedding at a department store sale, a navy blue ensemble that looked elegant and appropriate for the formal garden setting. My father had purchased his first tuxedo, insisting on buying rather than renting because he wanted to look worthy of the occasion. Their preparations were touching and heartbreaking, evidence of their determination to honor their daughter's special day despite their complete bewilderment at the scale of celebration they were joining. 2 weeks before the wedding, I made the final payment to the venue, transferring $25,000 from my consulting account to cover the balance due on space rental, catering, and service charges. The transaction represented months of work with startup clients, evenings spent analyzing market trends and crafting investment strategies, weekends devoted to building the expertise that had made this moment possible. 1 week before the wedding, I paid Madame Dubois the final balance on my dress, along with Linda's outfit and the accessories Catherine had selected for the bridesmaids. The total came to $18,000, more than my parents' combined annual clothing budget, but necessary for maintaining the illusion that everyone in the wedding party belonged to the same social and economic class. 3 days before the wedding, I transferred the remaining balances to the photographer, florist, musicians, and transportation company. The final accounting showed that I had spent exactly $42,000 on a celebration that everyone would remember as generous, tasteful, and perfectly appropriate for a Hartwell family wedding. Nobody would ever know that Sarah Martinez had bought her own fairy tale with money earned through brilliance that none of them had bothered to recognize. The night before the wedding, I sat in my apartment surrounded by the remnants of 3 months' planning. Vendor contracts were filed in careful order, payment confirmations were organized by category, and my consulting computer showed a dramatically reduced bank balance that would require months of additional work to restore. I had successfully created the perfect wedding for Michael and the perfect impression for his family, and I had done it entirely on my own terms. My phone buzzed with a text from Linda, expressing her excitement and gratitude for everything coming together so beautifully. Another message from Catherine thanked me for being the perfect addition to their family. Michael's text was simple and heartfelt, telling me how much he loved me and how eager he was to start our life together. I realized that tomorrow would mark not just my wedding day, but the successful completion of the most complex financial and social performance of my life. I had paid for a celebration that would establish my place in Chicago society, while concealing the intelligence and resourcefulness that had made it possible. I had protected my parents from financial stress, while ensuring that Michael's family would never question my worthiness to join their ranks. Most importantly, I had done it all while maintaining the love and respect of a man who valued me for who I was, even though he had no idea who I really was capable of being. The wedding day dawned clear and warm, exactly the kind of perfect June morning that Linda had been praying for since we'd selected the garden ceremony location. I woke at 5:30 in the hotel suite Catherine had booked for the bridal party, my stomach churning with a mixture of excitement and the kind of exhaustion that came from months of living multiple lives simultaneously. The morning unfolded with the precision Linda had orchestrated. Hairstylists arrived at 6, makeup artists at 7:30, and photographers at 8 to capture what Linda called the getting ready magic. My bridesmaids chatted and laughed as professionals transformed us into polished versions of ourselves, but I found myself thinking about the bank statements hidden in my apartment that showed exactly how much this magic had cost. Catherine appeared in the mirror behind me as the makeup artist applied the final touches. "You look absolutely radiant," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Michael is the luckiest man in Chicago, and Mom is beside herself with joy."
Everything you and your family have done to make this day perfect, it means the world to all of us." Her words hit me with unexpected force, because they contained such genuine gratitude for sacrifices she couldn't begin to imagine. I smiled and thanked her, accepting praise for my family's generosity, while knowing that every dollar had come from work I'd done in secret during countless late nights and early mornings. The ceremony site was transformative when we arrived for final preparations. The gardens looked like something from a fairy tale, with elaborate floral arrangements that I had personally approved and paid for, creating an aisle of white roses, peonies, and greenery that led to an altar draped in flowing fabric. The string quartet was tuning their instruments under a canopy of white silk, and guests were beginning to arrive in the kind of elegant attire that suggested this was exactly the social event Linda had envisioned. I watched from a window in the bridal preparation room as Michael's extended family filled the white wooden chairs, arranged in perfect rows across the manicured lawn. Business associates arrived with their wives, college friends traveled from distant cities, and neighbors from Lake Forest appeared in clothing that cost more than most people's monthly salaries. The guest list had grown to nearly 200 people, each one representing Linda's vision of a celebration worthy of the Hartwell family name. My parents arrived exactly on time, my father looking distinguished in his new tuxedo, and my mother elegant in her navy dress. I watched them navigate the crowd with careful politeness, shaking hands with people whose names they'd heard, but whom they'd never met, accepting compliments about the beautiful celebration while having no idea how to respond appropriately. Linda appeared in the doorway of the preparation room, wearing the designer dress I had secretly purchased for her, a stunning creation in champagne silk that complemented her silver hair perfectly. She looked every inch the mother of the groom at Chicago's wedding of the year, and her happiness was so genuine that I felt a stab of guilt about the deception that had made this moment possible. "Sarah, darling," she said, taking my hands in hers, "I need you to know how grateful Richard and I are for everything your family has done. This celebration is absolutely magnificent, and I know it represents such sacrifice and love. We don't take that lightly." I squeezed her hands and managed to say something appropriate about family and love and the joy of joining our lives together, but her words felt like weights settling in my chest. Linda's gratitude was real, her assumption about my family's financial contribution was reasonable, and my deception was becoming harder to maintain with each passing moment. The photographer called for final shots before the ceremony, and I found myself posing with my bridesmaids in front of floor-to-ceiling mirrors that reflected back a scene of perfect bridal elegance. The woman in the white dress looked confident, radiant, and appropriately grateful for her good fortune. She also looked like someone who belonged in this world of elaborate celebrations and casual luxury, which was exactly what I had been aiming for all along. Michael's first look took place in the garden's rose arbor, a private moment before the ceremony that would provide the photographer with emotional content for the wedding album. When he turned and saw me in Madame Dubois' creation, his face went through a series of expressions that would have been comical if they hadn't been so genuinely touching. Wonder, joy, disbelief, and finally a kind of overwhelming gratitude that suggested he couldn't quite believe this day was actually happening. "You're the most beautiful woman I've ever seen," he whispered, taking my hands in his. "I can't believe I get to marry you. I can't believe any of this is real." His emotion was so genuine, his happiness so complete, that I found myself fighting back tears that had nothing to do with wedding day joy, and everything to do with the complexity of loving someone while hiding fundamental truths about who you really were. Michael was marrying Sarah Martinez, devoted assistant and loving partner, with no idea that he was also getting Sarah Martinez, brilliant financial strategist and successful entrepreneur. The ceremony itself was everything Linda had envisioned and more. The string quartet played Pachelbel's canon as the wedding party processed down the rose-lined aisle, and guests rose to their feet with the kind of appreciative murmur that suggested they recognized quality when they saw it. My father walked me down the aisle with pride evident in every step, and when he placed my hand in Michael's and whispered his blessing, I realized that all the financial stress and secret planning had been worth it to see this moment of pure joy on his face. The officiant, Judge Hamilton, whom Linda had selected for his combination of judicial dignity and social connections, spoke about love, commitment, and the joining of two families with words that felt both traditional and personal. Michael's vows were heartfelt and specific, referencing moments from our relationship that made our guests smile with recognition. My own vows focused on partnership, support, and building a life together that honored both our individual dreams and our shared values. When Judge Hamilton pronounced us husband and wife, the applause from 200 guests created a sound that seemed to fill the entire garden. Michael's kiss was soft and sweet, and as we turned to face our families and friends as a married couple, I felt a moment of pure triumph that had nothing to do with the wedding's success and everything to do with the fact that I had created this moment entirely on my own terms. The cocktail hour unfolded on the mansion's terrace, with servers passing elaborate hors d'oeuvres and the kind of champagne that Linda had insisted was appropriate for a celebration of this caliber. Guests mingled with the easy familiarity of people who attended events like this regularly, and the photographer captured candid moments that would document not just our wedding, but our successful integration into Chicago's social elite. I moved through the crowd accepting congratulations and compliments, everyone praising the beauty of the ceremony and the elegance of the celebration. Several people mentioned specific details that had impressed them: the quality of the flowers, the excellence of the music, the perfection of the venue selection, never imagining that the bride herself had researched, selected, and paid for every element they were admiring. Richard found me during the cocktail hour, approaching with the kind of measured warmth he reserved for important occasions. "Sarah," he said, taking both my hands in a gesture that felt both paternal and formal, "I want you to know how impressed Linda and I are with today's celebration. Your family's attention to detail and commitment to excellence, it speaks to the values that make for successful marriages and strong families." His words were meant as high praise, recognition that I had passed some final test of worthiness to join the Hartwell family. The irony was that he was completely correct about my attention to detail and commitment to excellence, but completely wrong about where those qualities had been applied. I thanked him gracefully while mentally calculating that his compliments were based on approximately $42,000 of my own money and 3 months of my own planning. Linda appeared beside us with tears in her eyes and a champagne flute in her hand. "The two of you," she said, gesturing toward Michael and me, "you're going to have such a beautiful life together. Sarah, you've brought such joy to our family, and today proves that love really can create miracles." Her emotion was genuine, her happiness was infectious, and her assumption that family love and financial sacrifice had created the day's magic was both touching and completely inaccurate. I hugged her and expressed appropriate gratitude while wondering how long I could maintain this level of performance without someone noticing the inconsistencies. Dinner was served in the mansion's main ballroom, transformed by the florist into something that looked like a fairy tale garden party. Round tables draped in ivory linens held centerpieces of white and blush roses, candles provided warm ambient lighting, and the catering staff moved with the kind of professional discretion that Linda had insisted was essential for events of this caliber. Michael's best man, his college roommate James, gave a speech that was funny and heartfelt, referencing Michael's bachelor days and expressing confidence that he had found his perfect match. Catherine spoke about gaining a sister and watching her brother become happier than she had ever seen him. My maid of honor, Jessica, managed to give a speech that was touching and appropriate without referencing the financial stress that the wedding expenses had created for the entire bridal party. When it came time for Michael and me to speak, we had prepared remarks that focused on gratitude, love, and the joining of two families. Michael thanked his parents for their love and support, praised my family for their generosity and welcome, and spoke about building a life together based on the values both our families had instilled in us. I thanked everyone for celebrating with us, expressed appreciation for the love and support that had made the day possible, and spoke about the joy of joining the Hartwell family while maintaining the strong foundation my own parents had provided. Neither of us mentioned money, sacrifice, or the complex logistics that had created the celebration everyone was enjoying. The speeches were perfect, the applause was enthusiastic, and the emotional content was genuine even though it was based on assumptions that were fundamentally incorrect. The dancing began with our first dance to "At Last" by Etta James, a song that felt both romantic and ironically appropriate given how long I had waited to find someone who loved me for who I appeared to be rather than who I actually was. Michael held me close as we moved across the dance floor, and I could see Linda wiping away tears as she watched her son begin this new chapter of his life.
The evening continued with the kind of celebration that Linda had orchestrated and I had funded, every detail perfect and every moment photographed for posterity. My parents danced together for the first time in years, their joy evident as they celebrated their daughter's success in marrying well. Michael's family mingled with our guests with gracious warmth, everyone commenting on what a perfect match we were and how beautiful the entire celebration had been. As the evening wound down and guests began making their departures, I found myself standing in the mansion's garden with my new husband, surrounded by the remnants of a perfect wedding that I had created through months of secret work and financial sacrifice. The vendors were already beginning to break down equipment, servers were clearing tables, and the photographer was capturing final shots of the bride and groom in the moonlit garden. Michael pulled me close and whispered in my ear about how perfect everything had been, how grateful he was for our family's love and support, and how excited he was to begin our married life together. His happiness was complete, his gratitude was genuine, and his assumptions about how this magical evening had come to exist were entirely wrong. 6 months later, we were living in a beautiful apartment in Lincoln Park that Michael had selected and I had secretly helped finance through a complex arrangement that allowed him to believe his salary was sufficient while my consulting income covered the difference. We had settled into married life with the kind of comfortable happiness that suggested our relationship was strong enough to survive the deceptions I was maintaining. Michael's career was flourishing, partly because I was still officially his assistant, but increasingly because my behind-the-scenes analysis was helping him make investment decisions that impressed his father and clients. Richard had begun including Michael in more significant business discussions, and there was talk of partnership opportunities that would accelerate his professional advancement beyond what anyone had originally expected. My consulting business had recovered from the wedding expenses and was growing more rapidly than ever. Word-of-mouth referrals from satisfied clients had created a steady stream of high-paying projects, and my reputation in certain Silicon Valley circles was becoming significant enough that I was considering whether to make the transition from secret consultant to official entrepreneur. The challenge was that success in my real career would necessarily reveal the extent to which I had been deceiving everyone about my capabilities, resources, and identity. Michael loved Sarah Martinez, the devoted assistant, but he had never met Sarah Martinez, the brilliant strategist. His family had embraced me as someone who belonged in their world, but they had no idea I had bought my place at their table, with money they had never imagined I could earn. Linda continued to call regularly, treating me as the daughter-in-law she had always hoped Michael would find. She included me in family planning, asked my opinion about social events, and praised my good influence on her son's career advancement. Catherine had become a genuine friend, someone I enjoyed spending time with, and whose company I valued beyond its social utility. My parents had retired to a small house in Arizona that I had secretly purchased for them, presenting it as a gift from Michael's family to honor their contribution to our wedding. They were living comfortably for the first time in their adult lives, able to enjoy their golden years without financial stress, completely unaware that their daughter's hidden success had made their security possible. The irony of my situation was becoming more apparent with each passing month. I had everything I had thought I wanted: a husband who loved me, a family who accepted me, financial security that allowed for any lifestyle I chose, and professional success that was limited only by my willingness to claim it publicly. But I also had a life built on deceptions that were becoming more complex and more difficult to maintain as time passed. Thanksgiving dinner at the Hartwell family home proved to be the moment when my carefully constructed world began to unravel. Linda had invited her sister Patricia to join us, a woman I had never met who possessed the kind of sharp intelligence and social awareness that made her dangerous to anyone trying to hide significant truths. Patricia was everything Linda was not: direct where Linda was diplomatic, skeptical where Linda was trusting, and possessed of an investigative instinct that came from 40 years as a journalist covering Chicago's business and social scenes. She had been traveling for most of the year, covering political developments in Washington, but had returned to Chicago just in time to meet her nephew's new wife. The dinner conversation was pleasant and familial until Patricia began asking questions about my family background with the kind of precision that suggested professional curiosity rather than polite interest. She wanted to know about my education, my career plans, and my thoughts about the financial planning industry with a specificity that made me increasingly uncomfortable. "Sarah," Patricia said as dessert was being served,
Linda tells me your family was incredibly generous with the wedding expenses. That must have been quite a stretch for parents in hospitality and logistics work. The comment was casual, but I could see the calculation behind her eyes. Linda looked slightly uncomfortable, as if she had shared information she perhaps shouldn't have, while Richard and Michael continued their conversation about quarterly reports without paying attention to the women's discussion. Family weddings are important, I replied carefully. Everyone contributes what they can when it matters most. Of course, Patricia agreed, but Linda mentioned some specific vendors that I happen to know are quite expensive. Madame Dubois, for instance, and that photographer everyone uses for the really significant social events. Those aren't the kind of choices families make unless they have substantial resources. The conversation continued with Patricia asking increasingly pointed questions about wedding costs, vendor selections, and family financial planning that revealed she had done her homework about our celebration. Linda was beginning to look distressed, realizing that her sister's questions were creating discomfort, but Patricia's journalistic instincts were fully engaged. Michael finally tuned into the conversation when Patricia asked directly about my career plans and whether I intended to continue working as an assistant or had aspirations for advancement in the financial sector. His protective instincts kicked in, and he began deflecting her questions with diplomatic responses about our happiness and shared goals. But Patricia wasn't finished. She mentioned that she had been researching a story about young entrepreneurs who were disrupting traditional consulting models, specifically mentioning several tech companies that had used unconventional financial analysis to secure major funding rounds. The description was remarkably similar to work I had done for clients, and I felt my carefully maintained composure beginning to crack. It's fascinating how these young analysts work, Patricia continued, her eyes fixed on me. They operate outside traditional firm structures, often using encrypted communications and complex payment systems that make them virtually invisible to conventional business networks. Some of them are earning more than partners at major consulting firms while maintaining complete anonymity. Linda looked confused by the direction of the conversation. Richard was still focused on his discussion with Michael, but I could see that Patricia had connected dots that nobody else had even noticed existed. Her questions weren't random curiosity about wedding expenses. They were the beginning of an investigation into inconsistencies she had observed and decided to explore. The evening ended with polite farewells and expressions of gratitude, but I knew that Patricia's questions marked the beginning of the end for my carefully constructed deception. She had the skills and resources to investigate further, and her suspicions had been aroused by details that I thought I had hidden successfully. That night, alone in our apartment while Michael was sleeping, I faced the reality that my double life was no longer sustainable. Patricia would continue investigating because that's what investigative journalists do when they sense a story. Eventually she would discover the truth about the wedding expenses, my consulting business, and the extent to which I had been deceiving everyone about my capabilities and resources. The question was whether I should wait for exposure or take control of the revelation myself. I could continue the deception and hope that Patricia's investigation wouldn't yield definitive proof, or I could find a way to reveal the truth on my own terms, before someone else revealed it for me. As I sat in the dark apartment, surrounded by the fruits of my hidden success, I realized that the choice wasn't really about maintaining deception versus revealing truth. It was about deciding what kind of person I wanted to be, and what kind of marriage I wanted to have. I had built something extraordinary through intelligence, hard work, and careful planning. The question was whether I was brave enough to claim it publicly and face whatever consequences that revelation might bring. The next morning brought a phone call that forced the decision. Patricia had left a voicemail, requesting a private meeting to discuss what she called some interesting financial questions about our wedding and my career background. Her tone was professional but persistent, the voice of someone who knew she had discovered something significant and was prepared to pursue it until she had the complete story. I listened to the message twice, understanding that this was the moment I had been dreading and preparing for since the day I decided to pay for my own wedding. Patricia's investigation would continue whether I cooperated or not, but I could still control how the truth was revealed and what story emerged from the inevitable exposure. Michael was still sleeping when I made my final decision. I would meet with Patricia, tell her everything, and ask for the opportunity to reveal the truth to my family before she published whatever story she was planning to write. It wasn't the ending I had originally envisioned for my carefully constructed deception, but it was an ending I could live with, and one that honored both the intelligence I had hidden and the love I had found along the way. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.